I am delighted to be here talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Forgive me for occasionally bending over to change the slides because we have no clicker tonight. I thought I'd start by giving you a little bit of context for why the imperative of teaching for global competence is so important to me and how this spark got ignited for me more than 13 years ago. And it was really through something pretty basic that I think we can all relate to, and that's a friendship. So this is my friend Madiha. I met Madiha in the year 2000 in New York City when we were both graduate students studying international affairs. And I was struck immediately. Madiha was born in Bangladesh. She grew up throughout the Mideast. She ended up in Singapore to attend high school, surrounded by peers from around the world. And from the moment I met her, I was struck by her effortlessly global worldview. She had this way of navigating new groups of people and cultures and events and places and could connect historical and contemporary issues so easily. She seemed so at home in the world. And I was drawn to her immediately. And we were both the daughters of educators. And so we both shared this belief that education could function as the great leveler, that it was the bedrock of any thriving society. And so despite having very different upbringings, through the course of that year, Madiha and I became quite close. And in the fall of our second year of graduate school, on September 12th, 2001, we woke up to a world that had been changed irrevocably from the acts of terrorism on 9/11. So as the world worked to mourn and grieve and lift one another up in the wake of that terrible tragedy, there was a darker narrative at play in New York City that was affecting people like my friend Madiha because she was Muslim. So this xenophobic backlash affected her in pretty deep ways. She was kicked in the shins while riding the bus. She was spit on the subway. She was called a terrorist in public when people were driving by. And even though I had studied international issues and was very aware that discrimination existed, it was the first time in my life that I was in such close proximity to someone that I dearly loved, in a city that we both loved, who was the subject of such intensely personal, hateful rage for her identity. And so while that made me very angry, it made Madiha empathetic. And she turned our conversations into contemplations about how is it that we develop our worldview? How do we come to know and understand ourselves in the context of the global world we live in? And we turned those conversations towards looking at the purpose of education. How is the world changing? And what does that mean about how we have to prepare for it? So the first thing that we considered was, what was the characteristics of that kind of change? And not obviously the world's been changing for some time, but what seemed to signify it and characterize it differently was the accelerating pace of that change. So my grandmother, who passed away at age 77, when she was in grade school, would have learned that there was a population of 2 billion people and that there were 100 elements on the periodic table. And we've recently just passed the 7 billion mark for global population, and there are now 118 elements known on the periodic table. So this idea that the half-life of knowledge, that the pace of change and the acceleration of that is so different, seems to characterize the space that we're living in. And two things seem to be markers for what the future would hold: that change was a constant, and that global interconnectivity would also be a constant. So we moved to considering what that might mean. And the three things that were really the anchors for understanding how was the world changing that had some implication on teaching and learning were pretty basic. The first was just who we are, our demography as a country. So this is the United States in 1970. It's 88% white, and many of the ethnic and cultural groups that are now thriving in the US were too small to even be measured in census data. Flash forward 40 years, and you look at 2010, and you see a pretty considerable shift. The white population declines to 75% of the total, and you see other groups being represented in a more robust way. Now project forward to less than 40 years from now to what 2050 is anticipated to look like. You see that in my lifetime, the white population drop goes from 88% to 47%, and for the first time, no ethnic or cultural group in this country will comprise a majority. So what does that mean about how we are prepared to live and work together in these new communities that are characterized by that diversity? What are the implications of that? And a more local way of looking at it outside the national scene is in the St. Paul Public Schools. So this is 2010 data. But the current diversity that we see and experience in St. Paul Public Schools exceeds that we're even imagining that will happen in 2042. So we're already there in so many local communities that are globally diverse. There's 126 languages spoken in the St. Paul Public Schools. And there was a 240% increase in the number of English language learning students from 1990 to 2010. And this diversity, make no mistake, is a benefit. It's an asset. We've long known that diversity contributes to technological advance, it spurs innovation in the arts, it spurs cultural innovation. But recently we're finding that places that are more open to cultural diversity and geographic proximity are also contributing and spurring economic development. Simply put, diversity leads to economic development and homogeneity slows it down. But make no mistake, this is also something that will challenge us as we consider what this new, more diverse landscape means for getting along and for being productive to solve community challenges together. The second thing we thought about that anchored our understanding of the changing world was really, how do we work? What does workforce preparation look like? What's the reality professionally that we're looking at? So it's not a secret that mom and pop to multinational now are connected, inextricably linked to a global economy. 1 in 5 jobs in the United States is now tied directly to international trade, and most states across the US have experienced a triple-digit percentage increase in that statistic in the last 2 decades alone. So this changes everything about business. It changes your consumer base, it changes your employees, it changes your supply chain. There's an entirely new way of thinking about business. So now business leaders, when questioned what workforce readiness should look like, have a totally different answer than they used to have. Technical knowledge is not as highly prized as it once was. The capacity, what graduates do with that knowledge, how they're able to think creatively and critically and apply that to new situations in a constantly changing environment, has a premium when you're looking for employment. So whether you're a fan or not of Coca-Cola and their practices and values, they are emblematic of this global interconnectivity within the business realm. So most of the companies on the S&P 500 in the US have just shy of 50% of their profits are generated abroad. Coca-Cola is the exception, has more than 80% generated abroad. And an even greater percent of their employees are foreign employees. They have operations in more countries than there are UN member states, in 206 countries. So when asked recently what challenges the CEO of Coca-Cola anticipates and currently deals with, he focused on the idea that the pipeline of American graduates that had the global knowledge, the cultural competency, and the capacity to interact across borders effectively to execute on their work was so limited, it was a serious problem. And further, that beyond just training for those jobs in this changing landscape, the idea that employees needed to be prepared to be retrained in a short period of time, because change was now the common denominator across the business community. And that employees that he was looking for needed to not only be able to anticipate change, but to adapt to it and to lead through it, and to do all of that in a global context. So the next thing that we considered was what our problems were and would be as the future progressed in this more global environment. And what we found to be true was that there were an increasing number of challenges that had both global causes and global consequences. There wasn't one country or individual responsible for it, nor one country or individual that could solve it. And they seem to be bonded by their complexity and interconnectivity. So the example I'll give is that of Bangladesh, which is where Madiha, my co-founder, is from. Bangladesh is a country in South Asia that's roughly geographically the size of the state of Iowa. But it has the population that's equal to half the population of the entire United States of America, at 150 million people. By 2050, it's estimated 17% of Bangladesh will be underwater. And in the next 35 years, an estimated 50 million people will be displaced, losing their homes, their livelihoods, their farmland. So for a moment, I want you to imagine moving half the population of the United States into the state of Iowa and then flooding 20% of it. The scope and severity of a refugee crisis of that magnitude in Bangladesh is really mind-blowing. But the reality is those kinds of problems are increasingly what are going to characterize what we encounter in this century. They're problems that have global causes and global consequences. No one country caused climate change, and no one country can solve it alone. And so this unprecedented level of cooperation is what is the new norm. So knowing that the world was headed for this more global reality, we started to contemplate, surely we're ready. What does it look like? Well, how are we preparing the next generation to be able to anticipate how to succeed, how to thrive, how to survive 10 and 20 and 50 years from now? It won't surprise many people in this room who have deep expertise in education that by and large for the last 100 years we've had an industrial schooling model. The world has changed at a pretty rapid pace, particularly in the last few decades, and education has not kept pace in a mainstream way. And there's a few things that characterize that. We still teach subjects in rigid disciplines, even though almost every problem you'll encounter in the real world, or the things that I describe, require interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary thinking to solve them. We still have basically the same structure for learning. Students sitting in desks, looking up at a teacher that delivers content, the same length of the school day, the same length of the school year. We have two new tools, new technological tools, but they're often applied to the same structure and limit the capacity to deeply engage students in learning through technology. And finally, we've been focused on testing, and what we're measuring isn't really what matters to thrive in that new environment. What we need are not good test takers, we need good problem solvers and engaged learners who are ready for the next generation. So knowing that this was the reality of the school system, Madiha and I in 2002 said, well, what would it look like to reimagine that system? What is it if the purpose of education is to prepare students to really thrive, to be prepared to be engaged citizens in our democracy, to be productive members of a workforce, to be problem solvers that could address local and global issues that affected people, places, stakeholders around the world? What would that look like? So we founded World Savvy in 2002 to address that. And our answer was global competence. The ability for every student, regardless of where they learn, to acquire the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to thrive in an interconnected global society. So we thought a lot about the component parts of that. Chief among them were values and attitudes. So not just an openness to new ideas and ways of thinking, but a desire to engage others authentically. Our self-awareness about our identity and our culture. Deep value for multiple perspectives. Comfort with ambiguity and change and unfamiliar situations, continuous reflection, questioning our prevailing assumptions, and being adaptive, and finally, empathy and humility. We thought a lot about the skills that comprise global competence, investigating the world, framing questions, and driving further inquiry, recognizing and articulating, and then applying that understanding of new perspectives to decision-making and thinking. Inclusive dialogue and active listening, resiliency, critical thinking. So when we thought about the values and attitudes and skills that we were looking to develop, they naturally lead to this idea of how do you want a globally competent graduate to behave? What does this world require us to do? So not only to value multiple perspectives, but to know when they're absent in a room, seek them out and apply them to the decisions that you're making and the problems that you're solving. Basing your opinions informed by exploration and evidence. Shared responsibility, focusing not only on the rights you have as a global citizen, but the responsibility that's therefore incumbent upon you to take action to improve conditions, and approaching things in a collaborative manner to problem solve. So for a moment, you can think about how this might apply, how this might play out in a classroom, in a K-12 classroom that's teaching for global competence. So what if students were allowed to be the drivers of learning? They could learn in diverse teams collaboratively, tackle complex problems in an interdisciplinary way, and be encouraged to focus on solutions. And along the way, we're encouraged to embrace failure as a part of that learning process. What if students had real agency in learning? They had voice and choice in choosing the content, the what and the how of how they learned, and then being able to be self-directed and move themselves through a learning experience that was more relevant to their lives? What if we could do more to support teachers to be able to support that journey and help students navigate ambiguity, to find their path to make real-world learning sticky and relevant and related to what's personal and meaningful to students? And finally, what if we measured what really mattered? What we know is going to be useful in the workplace, in our communities, and as problem solvers globally. And this might seem like an insane or very far-off notion, but I want to use a case study that's gotten a lot of press over the last couple of decades, and that's of Finland. So by show of hands, how many of you have read a lot about what Finland is doing in this? Okay, great. So we've got a friendly audience for that. So Finland, about 40 years ago, enacted education reform that started to really move away from the more Western view of how to a test-driven, centralized system of looking at education, and went back to sort of a basic notion of how do you prepare kids for the world? What do they actually need to be prepared? And 2 years ago began to enact one of the most radical initiatives in education reform that basically did away with teaching by subject to transition to teaching by topic, something they call phenomena teaching. So essentially the notion was, how does the world work? What do students need to be prepared for, and how do we align our teaching and learning to prepare them for that? So for instance, a student might learn cafeteria services as a vocational element of what they're learning that includes math and communication and writing and foreign language to develop the ability to work with customers from lots of places. Or in a more academic pursuit, they might learn about the European Union by learning economics and geography and history, rather than separating these things, bringing them together in a multidisciplinary way. And they're beginning to scrap even the structures that exist in what we traditionally think of as a K-12 environment. So rather than having students sitting in rows and looking up at the front of the room, they have them working in small teams, collaboratively, practicing their communication skills, tackling complex problems, driving their own learning by asking their own questions. Finland has a lot of things, too, that shake up our traditional assumptions of what should be the foundation. What are the elements that would set a tone for effective K-12 reform? And these are snapshots of some of them that you may be familiar with. One is that children start school at age 7 and are tested for the first 6 years of their education. The first standardized test they're exposed to is mandatory at age 16. Students rarely take exams and don't have much homework until they're in their teens. And all children are taught in the same classroom. So this notion of gifted and remedial is scrapped in the service of diverse learners together in a room. And surprisingly, they have one of the smallest, what we would call achievement gaps in the world. Finland has the same amount of teachers as New York City, but far fewer students, 600,000 versus 1.1 million. So teachers have fewer students, but they also have more time. They have 2 hours of professional development a week and only 4 hours of teaching a day. So they're encouraged and promoted to learn more and to engage and reflect and evolve as they are confronted with new situations. And finally, they're selected from the top 10% of graduates, are given master's degrees, and they effectively have the same prestige and respect as doctors or lawyers. So I know that this might seem outrageous, that some of the conditions in the context, and I would never recommend that wholesale you take the phenomena happening in Finland and drop it into the US education system. But it's there as an idea to suggest that with the world changing in the way that it is, and knowing that we are failing to truly prepare students for that reality, that large-scale change is possible, and that a rethinking of how we design thinking, learning, and teaching in this era is really required. Because when we think about what the job and the purpose of education is now, we don't need to train students to solve the problems we know that currently exist. We need them to be trained to solve problems we don't yet have the imagination to conjure. And teaching and learning for global competence is a pathway to doing that. So, thank you very much.